So Pete's behavior is extremely interesting. And what we're seeing with Pete is that he's keeping quite still. So I'm thinking that he's going into a bit of a freeze response. He's keeping his eyes on Donald Trump, but he's sitting very still and he's blinking very rapidly. There was a very, very subtle micro expression that Pete Hegseth was showing, and you notice that John Ratcliffe, completely different posture. So I'm Dr. Beth Dawson. I am a communication expert and I have been working in communication and doing body language analysis for over 20 years. Body language analysis is a science. We never draw quick conclusions. So I'm never going to say because somebody is sitting like this, for example, crossing their arms, that they are angry, that they're defensive. There could be a myriad of reasons why they're doing this. That's why it's very, very important to consider context, to consider baseline, and to not come to quick conclusions. It's not because we say nonverbal communication or body language that we don't include language. We can also look at what someone is saying or what they're not saying, which can also be just as interesting, what they're leaving out. Okay, so we're looking at a clip from the 7th of July that features President Donald Trump, Pete Hegseth, and John Ratcliffe. So in this clip, Donald Trump is telling reporters at the White House that he's resuming sending defensive weapons to Ukraine. So what we first see, and what I like to do is kind of get an overall feeling. So I'll watch the clip, first before I kind of then break it down and look at sort of like different sections and different behaviors.
President, are you planning to send more weapons to Ukraine?
We're going to send some more weapons. We have to. They have to be able to defend themselves. They're getting hit very hard now. They're getting hit very hard. We're going to have to send more weapons. Yeah, defensive weapons primarily, but they're getting hit very, very hard.
So obviously what we see, Donald Trump. So this is his usual style of communication. We're not really seeing anything particularly different, but what we are seeing is that he's leaning forward. He does this sometimes when he's talking. He's leaning forward. His hands are out of sight. He's put his hands, we can't really see his hands. We get a sense that they're perhaps under the table. Nothing really surprises me in the way that he is communicating. This is Donald Trump in his usual style. It's classic Donald Trump posture when he's seated. So he's leaning forward. He's leaning in, so he's leaning towards the reporters. So when we lean towards somebody, we're often, we're sort of taking them into our confidence. We're sharing a secret. He's telling them something that he knows that they are going to be surprised about. And they were surprised, obviously, and they did ask questions. So the other thing that's really interesting in his posture and in his behavior is that he's hiding his hands. He's got his hands under the table. So the hands are extremely interesting to observe when we're looking at body language and nonverbal communication. Obviously, culturally, in the English language, we have the expression, show your hands. Somebody who's showing their hands, it's often symbolic with being honest, being open, being transparent. So our hands are very expressive. They can show us a lot. So somebody that's hiding their hands, we're often thinking, what else are they hiding? They're leaning in. He's signaling this intimacy. He's also sort of saying, I don't necessarily want to shout this from the rooftops, which is quite ironic because obviously he's telling this to reporters and he knows that it will be reported. But there's this idea of, okay, I'm going to share a secret with you. I'm telling you this in confidence. He's leaning forward. Again, he's leaning forward, but he's hiding his hands. So that's really interesting. And then what I observed was Pete Hegseth. So Pete's behavior is extremely interesting. I like to compare human behavior sometimes with animals because I think it's very, very telling. And in this clip, what I'm seeing is Pete is the rabbit, Donald Trump is the fox. Now, when I say the rabbit, think of the rabbit, that notices a predator. What does a rabbit do? It keeps its body quite still. And what we're seeing with Pete is that he's keeping quite still. So I'm thinking that he's going into a bit of a freeze response. He's keeping quite still. He has some micro expressions with his head. He's nodding a little bit, but there's something very, very interesting that he's doing. He's looking at Donald Trump constantly. His eyes, he's keeping his eyes on Donald Trump, but he's sitting very still and he's blinking very rapidly. So blinking rapidly can be very symbolic. We also have to be very careful not to jump to too many conclusions. It can also be a physiological response. It could be because, there's air conditioning, the room is, your eyes are dry, you're tired. This can also be why somebody is blinking rapidly. So what I'll also look at is what else is going on. So it's not just that he's blinking rapidly, he's keeping still. He's blinking rapidly. So this combination, keeping still, watching Donald Trump, it's the fight, flight, freeze response. It's like a prey animal watching a predator. And what he's also signaling is, don't notice me. Don't notice me. Don't draw me into this. That's why he keeps looking at him. That's why he keeps watching him with his eyes. We often say that somebody that's rapidly blinking, it could also be because they're, it's cognitive load. There's a lot of thoughts going on. It might be, it could be that Pete is overthinking. It could be that he's mentally stressed, but it's often associated with tension and nervousness. And I think that's what we're seeing here. I don't think it's physiological. I think it's real. I think it's tension. I think it's nervousness, because we're also seeing the tight jaw. He's got his mouth closed. His jaw is tight. So the fact that he's blinking rapidly, we've got this tight jaw, this supports the stress interpretation, if you like. There was another part on the clip that I thought was extremely interesting. So again, it's Pete Hegseth, and what we see here is, and you have to slow the video down to see it, but it's the part when Donald Trump is talking about, he says, if it was me, if it hadn't been Biden, if it was me, there wouldn't have been, if I'd been president instead of Biden, there wouldn't have been a war.
But this is something that would have never happened if I were president. This is a war that was never going to happen. Go ahead.
This is really interesting. I noticed it immediately, but there was a very, very subtle micro expression that Pete Hegseth was showing. There was a one-sided frown. So the one-sided frown is very interesting. So when we see like the two, eyebrows that are coming down, they're symmetrical. This is often anger, it's frustration. The one side can indicate doubt or skepticism. And what's interesting is he says this at this very point when Donald Trump says, if I'd been president instead of Biden, there wouldn't have been a war. Pete Hegseth looks at him. One of the eyebrows comes down. It's very subtle. It's very subtle, but not just the eyebrow that comes down. The lower lip juts out very subtly. It's the classic pout. Often seen in children, carried into adulthood. He juts out his lower lip. So the pout, very subtle, but this is defiance, resistance, accompanied with the eyebrow movement, can also be mild skepticism, contempt. So I'm not saying that he is, there may be many reasons why he's thinking that's not the case. If you were president, we would still have had a war. It doesn't necessarily reflect on how he's feeling about Donald Trump. It might just be his own feelings about the war in general. We would still have had a war. It could be something quite separate from how he feels about Donald Trump. But it's very interesting that we see that at that very moment. And you notice that John Ratcliffe, completely different posture. John Ratcliffe is sitting next to Pete, and John Ratcliffe is looking, forward. He's kind of got a very different attitude. So Hegseth is holding it together. As I said, he's definitely nervous and tense, but John Ratcliffe is showing surprise. So he leans back. It's that typical response. Somebody says something, you're like, what? Wow. Oh, I didn't know that. You can see it very clearly as Donald Trump is saying that they will be resuming sending defensive weapons to Ukraine. John Ratcliffe leans back, which is a surprise. But it also looks like he has raised his eyebrows, which is the typical surprise response, but definitely his posture and his movement. So it looks like he is surprised. Now, there could be, again, coming back to context, there could be reasons for this. It could be that he wasn't expecting Donald Trump. It might be that he knew. It might not be surprise about the fact that this is what Donald Trump's plans are. His surprise might be the fact that, well, why is he announcing it now and here? Again, we don't always have the context. What we're seeing, so I can tell you what we see, but you have to sort of understand that, without some of the context, we might be missing a few things. So a different reaction to Pete, the blinking. And, again, as I said, Donald Trump, we see him, you know, he's leaning forward, he's hiding his, he's not showing his hands. Very, very interesting to see that behavior as well.